Welcome to AMB 201 Marketing and Audience Analytics, previously known as Marketing and Audience Research. This video covers Module 1, Part A, Introduction to the Unit. In this video, what I want to do is give you a brief introduction to AMB 201 as a study subject and talk a little bit about the value you can get out of studying a subject like this. I'll talk about the overall structure of the unit so that you understand how it runs and how you're going to get content across the semester, and I'll introduce you to the teaching team so that you know who you're going to be engaging with across the coming weeks and who you'll interact with when you go along to classes. I'll talk about the details of the two pieces of assessment that we have in AMB 201, and these are two very practical research projects that students tend to get a lot out of, where we have a research question and you go out and collect data in order to answer them. So I'll outline the details of that assessment. And the other thing I'll do in this video is provide some data and some information on how students have performed in the past in AMB 201, so that you can think about how you might work across the semester in order to optimize your learning and maximize the grade that you get out of the unit, if that's your goal. So what is AMB 201? It's a research-oriented subject where you'll learn a lot about the diversity of different types of research methods that are available to you in order to answer a research question, or research methods that are available to produce data that you might then interpret. So we also talk about the data analytic techniques that match each of those research methods in order to get information from them. We call it Marketing and Audience Analytics because much of the unit and the assessment tasks are very much contextualized within a marketing and a consumer type setting, or with a consumer type marketing and consumer type focus, where we think about the audiences that businesses are trying to engage. Having said that, though, a lot of the techniques and methods that we'll be talking about are very much general. So we'll be talking about research interviews and focus groups, research surveys and experiments and observational methods, and how to analyze data from that using things like thematic analysis and statistical analysis, so those analytic techniques. Each of those is very much general to research across the board. So regardless of if you come from an advertising background or a public relations background, journalism background, an entertainment background, or a law background, information technology, or even the physical sciences, the techniques and methods that we talk about in AMB 201 are pretty much general. They're going to be relevant to you, so you'll get a lot of value out of it. Don't be concerned that it's called Marketing and Audience Analytics if that's not your specific area. The methods we talk about are going to be very relevant to you. We give a lot of, through the modules and the lectures, we give a lot of technical details and go over the pros and cons of the different types of methods available. However, as part of the assessment and the tutorial activities, we very much have a lot of practical exposure and practical experience built in. So you do get real research experience both as a participant and as a researcher in this subject. So it's quite a useful subject in giving a very comprehensive understanding of the research process and why we engage in research, how we interpret data, and the types of conclusions we draw. It's going to be of value, obviously, for anyone who wants to work in marketing or market research, but more broadly than that, it's of value to anyone who wants to work in business in general or in management in general, because regardless of what type of work you go into, you're always going to be bombarded with different types of data that people have collected with research and different conclusions that people have drawn themselves based on data that has been collected. As someone in business or as a manager, you need to be able to gauge whether or not and evaluate whether or not that data or those conclusions are valid. You need to be able to think critically about how that data has been obtained and the conclusions that have been drawn to know whether or not you can rely on them. So it's very important to have this fundamental understanding of research through subjects like AMB 201, even if you don't intend to work in research. Bigger than that though, as consumers and as people who interact in daily life with the regular world and through platforms like social media, we're constantly bombarded with other people's claims and other people's data, and we need to be able to think critically about those claims and about that data to know whether or not we can trust them. No one wants to be the gullible person that believes a claim, a bogus claim spouted on social media, right? So a subject like this will teach you how to think critically in terms of the pros and cons of different types of data and different types of research methods, so that you're not that person. So it's quite an important subject to understand. And AMB 201 will give you that knowledge. So by the end of the semester, not only will you have an understanding of the research process and the pros and cons of different types of research methods and data analytic techniques, but you'll have an appreciation of what it's like to be a researcher and what it's like to be a research participant, both sides of the coin. You'll be able to design research to answer a research problem that you have, and we'll be dealing with marketing problems or marketing questions. You'll be able to undertake research yourself. You will have done that as part of the unit. You'll be able to think critically about how to analyze data, how to evaluate data, and how to present data findings that come from research. All right, so who is on the teaching team? My name is Clinton Weeks, and I'll be the unit coordinator and lecturer for AMB 201 across the semester. It's my voice that you'll hear on the recordings. When I'm on campus, my office is located in Z Block on level 10. It's room Z1022. If you need to contact me, my email address and phone number are shown on the screen. Email is the best way to reach me because it allows me to respond at the morning and the afternoon or in the evening, whereas with my phone, I'm not always in my office. If you do need an appointment, just email me and we'll set something up. We can speak over Zoom if that suits. In terms of the teaching team on the tutorial side of things, we've got a really good team this semester. We've got Dr. Maria Kaya. Maria, you may have encountered before. She's lectured AMB 201 previously, as well as other subjects such as brand management and innovation. Maria researches in the space of innovation, and she has done really interesting studies around things like the way music impacts consumers in the purchase environment. We've also got Kelly Crow. Kelly is a doctoral candidate within the school, and her research area is it examines things like the way fatigue impacts the way people do things such as donate or make purchases, and the way that's also influenced by things like the assortment size that people are presented with. We've also got Ulrika Fantons, who is a Master of Philosophy candidate. She researches in international business and the way the digitalization of firms helps them to move or become more international. So quite a knowledgeable and very experienced team for AMB 201 this semester, and I'm sure you'll get a lot of value out of meeting your tutors and engaging with them as part of tutorials. In terms of other contacts around the university, primarily for things like your enrollment or administrative matters, if you have issues with uploading assignments, you've got HiQ, which is located on level 3 of V Block in the library, and their email address and phone number are listed there. When you are emailing anyone on our team or any of your unit coordinators or lecturers or tutors in general, it is always helpful to include a few things. It seems pretty obvious, but not everyone does it. So do be sure to include your unit code as well as your name and your student number. That helps us to identify you, but also helps us to know what unit or what piece of assessment you're referring to, because a lot of our tutors, for example, are teaching across multiple units and don't always remember exactly which tutorial that you're in, so it can speed up the process. What I would ask is that if you're contacting anyone in the AMB 201 team, make sure you use your QUT email address, particularly if you're asking something about your grades or have a question about how you've gone in assessment or want to discuss something about the assessment, because it's very important for protecting your own privacy that we're able to confirm that it's you that we're talking to or that we're corresponding with. And then the other thing that I always ask is, if you do have a question for the AMB 201 team, always start with your tutor and send that email just to your tutor. There's no need to email everyone on the team and have everyone responding with the same question. It's just not efficient. We've got a good team in place, highly knowledgeable. You'll get the same information from everyone. So please just send an email to one person only and then wait for the response rather than sending multiple emails out to everyone on the team. All right, so how does AMB 201 run in terms of its general structure? It breaks up into 4 overall modules, and they're listed here on the screen. The first 2 modules will run in the first 6 weeks of semester, and the second 2 modules will run in the second portion of semester, in the final 6 weeks of semester. Module 1 relates to research basics, so this is the one that we've commenced right now. So this is where we'll introduce you to marketing and audience research and analytics, and talk about the general research process, and we'll also talk a little bit about research ethics. Ethics is often seen as a little bit boring and often tacked on to the end of units, and most people don't find it too engaging. In this unit, though, I approach it a little bit differently, and I talk about the origins of some of the ethical principles we have in place that impact the way we conduct research. And I find that's really quite engaging and quite a powerful way to teach about ethics, because when we know some of the history about why certain principles are in place and what's gone wrong in the past, it can often make it a lot more meaningful about why we have to behave ethically in that research setting. So it's an interesting portion. Listen to that lecture or come along to that lecture if you can. Module 2 is really where we overview the different research methods available to you as a researcher, or to researchers in general. So we'll talk about qualitative research, which is your interviews and focus groups, talk about observational research, survey research, and experimental research. Module 3 and 4 are really where we get into the nitty-gritty of primarily quantitative research. This is where we'll talk about setting up how you would set up a survey, and things like selecting your sample, the types of questions you want to ask, and types of things that you want to avoid in order to minimize the error when you're collecting data. And then module 4 is where we talk about data analytics in the quantitative space, so how we would go back and analyze quantitative data that we collect via survey, for example. And this is a really interesting module in our unit, because the data that we talk about in that lecture come from the class. So we'll generate data as part of the assessment, and then we'll run through the analysis in that module. So we'll talk about how we can clean up the data in order to make it really analyzable and conduct that analysis based on the data that we use. So that's a really interesting way to go about doing that. I think you'll find you get a lot out of it. None of these are particularly stressful modules. We often think about research as being, or analytics as being a little bit stressful, a little bit daunting. There's nothing to be too stressed about in this unit. So how do the lectures actually run in AMB 201? Well, we employ a range of approaches that are a little bit different to many of the other units that you've probably done. So in AMB 201, rather than just running a lecture and then posting a recording after the fact, what we do is have a range of materials available to you prior to the lecture, including all of the lecture content pre-recorded, so that you can review that material before the class and then decide if you want to come along and attend the overview of that material. So all of that will be available to you. We've got 4 modules in the unit that I just referred to, and those 4 modules will be released, or the content for those 4 modules will be released across weeks 1, 3, 7, and 10 respectively. So at the start of those weeks, all of that modules material becomes available to you. You can then work through that in an intensive binge sort of mode, or you can pace yourself out across the next couple of weeks in moving through that. We really tailor that, or allow you to tailor that to what suits your learning style. In addition to that, we've got a large suite of supplementary material that you can also make use of. Now, the unit runs such that everyone should make use of those resources, and everyone should make use of the pre-recorded lecture content. That lecture content is the content that you'll get as learning material for the unit. Now, at the start of each of those modules, or in weeks 1, 3, 7, and 10, we'll also overview the key content. We might go through a couple of additional things, like some cases that might help support learning in that as part of those modules, and then I'll allow some time, or I'll have some time, sorry, for Q&A if anyone has any questions about that content. And then in the other week, of course, I'm available for consultation to answer any of the questions about that content that you have. In terms of the tutorials, these are really quite handy in AMB 201 because tutors will step you through what you need to do for the assessment pieces in a very hands-on or practical way. So there's a range of activities that tutors will take you through that essentially guide you on what you need to do for your assignments, as well as for better understanding the learning content from across the semester. So it's useful to attend the tutorials, whether online or wherever, because you get those hands-on activities or those practical activities, but you also get to be in contact with your tutor, who is very knowledgeable in the area of research, and tutors will also be marking your report, so they're quite handy because they can answer questions about those. Make sure you do reach out and make contact with your tutor if you do have questions or you don't understand any of the content, but try to get along to as many of those tutorials as you can. In terms of the tutorials, the following the tutorial taking place, a recording will be available so that anyone who misses that tut that week will be able to catch up on what they've missed. In addition to the lecture content and the tutorials, we've also got regular consultation available with myself and all of the tutors. This can be done via Zoom or via Skype. You might want a phone, or depending on feasibility, in person might be possible, though as you can imagine, not always. Usually email is sufficient, so if you just have a short, simple question, send that off as an email, because it's much easier to answer an email and it saves everyone a lot of time rather than coming to campus or setting up a Zoom meeting or a Skype meeting or a phone call or whatever. So try to sort anything out by email, but if it's something a bit more complex, arrange a consult with someone on the teaching team. Now, AMB 201 for a number of years has been set up with very flexible delivery. So this semester is no different. So things have changed quite a lot in the university environment. But in terms of AMB 201, our delivery is pretty much in line, or largely in line, with how it has been offered in the past. So AMB 201 is set up in line with what we call adult learning principles. Now, these are principles built around the way and based on research, but built around the way adults typically learn. And we know that adults learn best when they can tailor learning to their particular learning style, and when the learning content matches what they see as their need for information. So think about that as you're choosing how you go about learning across the semester, whether you're going to attend the tutorials each week or rely on the recordings, whether you're going to make use of Q&A sessions, how you're going to do that. So we do provide a range of opportunities for learning through all of those modes and the additional resources that I outlined. So what I would say is try to make use of those if you want to get the most out of the unit. If you do choose something across the semester though, and you find that it's not working for you, what I would say is just do consciously sit back and think about whether you need to change something, because with your university experience, you really do want to make the most of it and get the most out of that, because you don't always have these same resources available to you when you want to learn something later on. So do make that conscious decision about how you want to learn, what you want to get out of the unit, and don't be afraid to go back and change that approach if you're finding that it's not working for you.
What I want to do is go through some performance patterns in AMB 201 from previous semesters that might help to inform the way you think about the level of work that you do, or the effort you put into the unit in order to achieve the grade that you want to achieve. As you know, around the university we have a grading system of 1 to 7, where 1 to 3 represent failing grades and 4, 5, 6 represent passing grades, where 4 is a pass, 5 is a credit, 6 is a distinction, and 7 is a high distinction. And what we can look to is a recent semester similar to this one, and how many students fell into each of the grade bands. And what you can see here is that we get roughly 10 to 12% of students, or in this case 12% of students in that fail range, which is a fair proportion of students, but not unusual in a unit like this. And then within that passing those passing grade bands, we see the bulk of students getting 4, 5s and 6s, with most getting 5. So it's a somewhat normal distribution around that 5 band, where the bulk of students are getting 5s, a few smaller proportions getting 4s and 6s, and then smaller proportions even further out from that. In this case, we can see 8% of students getting 7s. So we can look to that data and use that to inform what we might expect for the current semester based on how students have performed in the past. So what that would suggest to you is that firstly, you do need to put in some effort, and you do need to study and work towards achieving a passing grade, because there are a large number of students who do actually fail. But if you do want to get a grade such as a 7, you do need to work hard. Not everyone gets a 7. One thing that you can start to do, or should start to do as a student of research when you're presented with data like this, is start to question whether or not it's valid data, so whether or not it represents what I'm saying it represents, and whether or not it's reliable data. When we talk about reliability in data, what we're really saying is how likely can I rely on that data to be showing a similar pattern to what might be produced again in the unit going forward. So what we could do is look at another recent similar semester and see whether those same trends are apparent. And if you look at the data for a year later, what we see is, again, we get a fair proportion of students in that failing those failing bands, in this case 8%. So again, close to that 10% of students failing, in this case 8%. A relatively small proportion of students getting 7s, and once again the bulk of students getting 4s, 5s and 6s, with most getting 5s, and then fewer students getting 4s and 6s, and then fewer further out from that. So by seeing that same pattern across time, what we would start to say is, well, that's looking like it's a reliable pattern in future semesters. Provided we don't really change too much, we'd expect to see similar patterns again going forward. So to you, what that would suggest is that this pattern is fairly expected and likely to occur again, provided nothing dramatic changes. So you can start to rely on that information to think about how you might want to perform. Now, that being said, one thing to keep in mind is that at QUT we don't mark to a distribution, or we don't force these distributions in our grading. Instead, in our case, we use criterion referenced assessment rubrics, or CRA rubrics, that specify what type of assignment will get a 7, what type of assignment or what things need to be present in an assignment to get a 7, what things a student needs to do in an assignment to get a 6, a 5, a 4, and what represents a fail, and so on. So you will have seen those descriptions or those rubrics when you've submitted work before for assignments, either in assessment documentation or in the submission portals, where those descriptions are provided as part of a rubric. So if you do want to achieve a grade, keep in mind, based on this, that not everyone gets a 7, that students do indeed fail, and you do need to put in effort. What do you need to do to achieve those grades? Or you need to be going back and looking at those rubrics to work out what constitutes each of those grade bands. From that, you could say, well, everyone could potentially get a 7, and that's certainly true, but it's not what we see in the data. So how else might you inform your studies going forward in a unit like this? Well, we can start to look at things like tutorial attendance, or relying on some of the recorded content. So one thing we do in AMB 201, and we've done across a number of years, is take attendance during tutorials, or have tutors have asked for students' names during tutorials to see who has attended. And what we've been able to do across time is look at the relationship between tutorial attendance and grades that students achieve. So going back a few years, we didn't always provide pre-recorded content about lectures, for example. We didn't always record tutorials, for example. So if we look at data or relationships between these two things before and after we started to do that, what we can start to judge is how valuable that type of material or those resources are to students. So if you look at attendance data relative to performance before that recorded content was provided, what you can see here is that we get this type of relationship. These red diamonds represent the mean grade or the mean score that students achieved in each of those based on the number of tutorials that they attended. So on average, students who attended no tutorials, and this is before recorded content was provided, and that pre-recorded lecture content was provided, the average was 49%. So actually in the fail range. So some students would have got higher than 49%, some students would have got lower than 49%, but the average was basically 49 or a fail grade. As more tutorials were attended, what we saw is that the overall grade or the score that people achieved tended to increase up until around 73.5% for students who attended all 11 tutorials. So in that semester there would have been 11 tutorials. When we see this type of pattern, so one variable increasing as another one, as a second variable increases, we say it's a positive relationship, or there's a positive correlation between those two variables. And you will have heard that in other parts of your life as well, where you hear about a positive correlation. It's simply that those two variables are each increasing together. It would be possible to get a negative relationship or a negative correlation if instead you had a downward sloping diagonal. So for example, if students who attended no tutorials achieved high grades, and then the more tutorials attended was associated with lower grades or lower scores. And certainly that could be the case if tutorials were wasting people's time and they weren't able to study. In that case, we would call that a negative relationship, or say that those two variables are negatively correlated. And we'll come back to that when we talk about data analysis later in the semester. So that's a nice bit of a primer for that. So negative relationships are where, as one variable increases, the other one decreases. A positive relationship or a positive correlation is where both variables increase. So from this data, what I could perhaps suggest is that coming along to tutorials is important and will help to improve the score that you achieve for the unit. However, as a student of research, what you should be doing is always questioning the claims and conclusions drawn from data and trying to ascertain whether or not an alternative explanation might be appropriate and whether or not I'm wrong. Right? So whenever you see a research claim in the media or in the literature, always try to think about, well, is that the correct claim, or could the data actually be interpreted differently? So here it may be the case, for example, if you think a little bit critically, that number of tutorials attended isn't really what's driving results. It may be something like the time availability that students have, or the motivation to perform well that students have, or time management skills that students have. As students have more time available to them, it may mean that they can study more and therefore achieve higher results. And they also happen to be able to get along to a larger number of tutorials. So in that case, it's not tutorial attendance that's driving performance, but instead it's something like motivation or time management. Right? So there's always that potential for alternative interpretations. If we look at that similar sort of relationship between attendance and performance after that recorded content was provided, you can see that that supports what I've just said. Once we've provided that recorded content, suddenly students who haven't been attending tutorials are performing more highly. So here the average score for students attending no tutorials moves from this fail range up to a passing range, where the average now becomes 57, almost 58%. So what that would suggest is, yes, we still have this positive relationship between tutorial attendance and performance, but clearly other things are at play in that these students who aren't attending tutorials are now also performing well or performing better. So from that, what I would perhaps suggest is that it's not tutorial attendance alone that's important, it's access to the material that's delivered in tutorials. If students can get access to that material, they don't necessarily have to come along to classes. And that's part of what drives us in providing all of the recorded content, and especially the pre-recorded content in units like AMB 201. So it's important to make use of that, I guess, is the takeaway message. All right, so some useful information for thinking about how you might perform well in a unit like AMB 201. Think about the grade that you want to achieve based on how students have performed in the past, but also keep in mind that it's useful, perhaps useful to attend tutes or at least access all of the content that's provided to you.
So where else can you get information about the content in AMB 201? Well, we also have a recommended textbook. Note, this is a recommended textbook, not a required textbook. So because we don't have an exam as such in AMB 201, we don't make the textbook required. We won't be conducting any sort of multiple choice test on the content or anything like that. That said, it is a recommended textbook because a lot of the content in the textbook corresponds very closely to what we talk about in the unit, and the sequence of the text follows along nicely with the sequence of AMB 201, so you'll get a lot of value out of it. I'd strongly recommend you purchase it if you can. It's a great resource for this unit, but it's also a great reference and resource for the future if you need to refer back to something to do with research. So this one is a Zikmund text, and it's the 4th edition. It's the Asia Pacific edition. So that means that the examples and the commentary that you find in this text are suited to Australia and to the Asia Pacific. So it's really quite useful and meaningful in that sense. So you can purchase this at a variety of sources online in hard copy format, but you can also purchase it through the QUT bookshop, and I'll show you how to in a second, in hard copy format but also ebook format. So if you want a cheaper version, or if you want a version that you can have on your electronic device, a mobile smartphone or an iPad or whatever, you can purchase the ebook format instead. If you don't want to purchase it, or you can't afford to purchase it, the library has copies, and to some extent you can also use past editions if you have access to those. The content is relatively similar. We have used older texts in this unit before, and if you can access those texts, while they tend to be okay in that a lot of the material is fairly similar, where they tend to differ is that the examples tend to be a little bit dated. So if you do use an older textbook, just be sure to pay attention to some of the commentary around the examples and stuff like that being a bit outdated. You might not see as much discussion around social media and those sorts of things, but the actual techniques don't tend to change too much, so older texts tend to be relatively okay. So that's our text.
So as you know, our main learning management system is Canvas. So let's have a look on Canvas for where everything is located, and then we'll talk a little bit about the assessment. I think most people are probably familiar with Canvas already, particularly if you're not new to QUT, but for those who are new or aren't familiar with Canvas, I'll run through a few of the sections that are going to be relevant to you. So when you log on to Canvas, you should, in our AMB 201 site within Canvas, you should come to our homepage, which is this page here, which overviews what AMB 201 is about. You've got an announcements option here in the menu on the left that will allow you to see the announcements that have been sent out. They should also go to your email, so if you're accessing those via email, there's no real need to come to Canvas specifically to see those. The syllabus page, most students don't really check that frequently, but it is a handy page for a number of reasons. On this page we have an overarching unit map or a schedule of what occurs throughout the semester with the unit. So here you can see the week associated with particular modules. So we run module 1 from week 1, module 2 from week 3, module 3 from 7 and 10, as we said before. Over here you've got tutorials, and then what occurs or what's the focus of each of the tutorials. Chapter readings listed here in this column. And then importantly, in this final column of the schedule, the unit map, is a keeping on track description, which for each week will outline what you need to do in order to stay up to speed with AMB 201, and particularly with the assessment. So what you should be doing in relation to the assessment each week, when you should be submitting material, and so on. Right? So that'll be an important thing for you to familiarize yourself with. One thing that's quite handy with the syllabus page is you've got the unit outline link here, so you can always go back and look at the formal document unit outline for the for AMB 201. And we've also got the academic calendar link. And this should be in a link in each of the units that you take. And where that's really handy is by letting you know where we're up to in terms of weeks of the semester, because across the semester you can sometimes forget which week it is, and because the schedule and the due dates for assessment are often specified in terms of week, you can forget where you're at. So accessing that academic calendar can be handy. That also outlines when public holidays are, census dates, and so on. So make sure you have a look at that. Now, for most of the units within the university, this modules option will be where most of the content in any unit lives and where most of the time that you spend on Canvas will be spent. So it outlines all of the technical detail of the unit, overviews the assessment, and also gives all of the learning content in terms of what you should be accessing week by week in terms of lectures and tutorials and so on. So let's have a bit of a look through some of these. So in the About AMB 201 page, you can see some general information on what AMB 201 is about. Now we can go back to the modules page to go next, or we can use this next button down the bottom here to go to the next option within that modules page, that being teaching team and contacts. So here you can see the members of the teaching team for AMB 201 and email addresses if you want to reach out to them. On the next tab, you've got information about when the lectures and tutorials run, so our on-campus tutorials and also our online tutorials, which day they are, what time they are, who the teaching member is, and where they're located. So the room listing here for our on-campus tutorials, and the Zoom link and a passcode if needed for the online tutorials, and then also for the lecture as well. You've got the room that's going to be conducted in those weeks 1, 3, 7 and 10, and then also the Zoom link. So that's located here in modules under class times and locations links. You've got the textbook information, the links that will allow you to purchase that, and you've also got an FAQs page. Now the FAQs page contains a lot of information that covers many of the questions that we get each semester. So what I'd ask is that you familiarize yourself with that content, or at least check the FAQs prior to sending off emails, because a lot of questions are answered there and you can get that information immediately rather than having to wait for an email. So have a read of the questions and the answers there. Back in modules, here you can see an overview of the assessment and the details of each of the assessment items, and we'll go through that momentarily. I'll come back to that in a second. And then down further, week by week, what you need to be doing in terms of learning content, so lectures and tutorials. So module 1 content, which spans weeks 1 and 2, is already released. So we're currently in module 1, that's what we're doing now. So if we click on that, you can see we get a bit of a blurb or an overview of what module 1 is about, the pre-recorded videos for each of the sections of that module, right? And then under each of those videos also some useful study resources. So these might be links referred to in the video, or directions to allow you to investigate the topic further. You can access the slides for each of these portions via this click here to download slides option under the title of each of those parts. So when we're talking about modules and all of the content being pre-recorded and available to you, this is what I mean. So all of the videos are provided here for you to access, and you can binge those if you like and knock them over all in one day for each module as they get released, or if you want to pace yourself across the semester, you're welcome to do that as well. So this material in each of the modules will be primarily focusing on in each of the in-person deliveries, but you can also access the exact same content here via these recordings. All right, and then in terms of tutorials, you also get that under these week by week options here. So if you click on tutorial 1, you can see you get a little bit of an overview of what the tutorial is about. You have an option to download the slides used in the tutorial, and a recording will also be available after the tutorials run, usually at the end of the week, for you to review that material as well if you've missed it or if you want to recap it. Okay, so that will be from one tutorial only. All tutors won't be recording their tutes, just one tutor will. A recording will be posted usually at the end of the week after the tutorials have run, and you can access that if you've missed the tute or if you want to review something. Within Canvas, you can also access your grades, support content from the university in terms of study resources, and then personal support such as counselling and so on if you require that. There's a link to the library and a link to Studiosity, which is a writing support function that the university provides. So that's a general overview of our Canvas site. As I said, I'll come back to the assessment in a second. If you haven't yet familiarized yourself with our Canvas site, I'd recommend you do that soon.
All right, so in terms of the assessment for AMB 201, you have two major projects: a qualitative project worth 50%, which corresponds to the first half of semester, and a quantitative project worth 50%, which corresponds to the second half of the semester. Now, the distinction between these two projects, qualitative and quantitative, corresponds to a major distinction within research in general. Researchers typically consider themselves either qualitative or quantitative, and these correspond to very different techniques that produce very different types of data and which require different types of data analytics. So qualitative research is research such as interviews and focus groups that generate verbal data. Here the researcher is interested in looking at really rich, detailed verbal data in order to work out interpretations of what they think is happening. Quantitative research, in contrast, is where the researcher uses things like surveys and experiments in order to gain quantifiable data or numeric data in order to think about quantitative analyses or statistical analyses. So in order to work out things like relationships between variables, relationships between constructs, whether construct A can predict construct B, for example. So they're very different types of research, and the two projects that you're going to do in AMB 201 correspond to each different type, and I think that's a really valuable approach in that it gives you as a student a good understanding of both types, but also helps you to understand which you trust more and which one you feel more inclined to, because people do tend to sway one way or the other. The final mark that you'll get in AMB 201 is simply the score or the sum of the two projects put together. So you don't necessarily have to pass each of the two projects. I would hope that most people want to pass each of the two projects. We simply add the scores together, and as long as you get 50% or more in total, then you've passed the unit. Each of the two projects is structured very similarly. Each of them has three major parts: part 1, part 2, and part 3. Part 1 we call the participant perspective. This is where you have the opportunity to go along to studies running within the business school and take part as a research participant in order to gain an understanding of what it's like to be a research participant. This is valuable not only so that you have that understanding of what it's like to be a participant, but also have some perspective around the way in which data is produced, so that we can really have an idea of whether or not that's trustworthy data or valid data. So only you as a participant truly understand if you understand questions being asked, or if you're producing data that's honest. So I think it's very important to get that perspective of what it's like to be a participant, to understand the type of data produced for a research project. For part 2, you're going to take the role of a researcher and go out and collect real research data that we're going to then analyze as a class, or analyze in order to write up your report. Part 3 is the more major written component, which is where you take the findings of your data analysis, and you write those up in a report. We call that communication of research. So part 1 and part 2 we consider short practical experiences. They're nothing particularly dramatic or nothing particularly stressful. The major part that will be more time consuming is part 3, writing up the report, summarizing that research. All right, I'll run through the detail of the qualitative and quantitative projects separately, so that you can see the nuances of each of those. Quick note before I do that though, whenever you see this little graphic here, I'm referring to the qualitative project. So these two little guys interviewing each other is more qualitative, so this represents qualitative project documentation. The documents start to look very similar after a little while, so I've indicated I'll use that different graphic to help you distinguish those. So the qualitative project is worth 50%, and it's composed of 3 parts. As I said, part 1 is the participant perspective. So with this, in the qualitative project, you're going to take part in 2 qualitative studies, or you'll have the opportunity to take part in 2 qualitative studies, and they'll typically last about 20 to maybe 30 minutes depending on the exact nature of that study. Usually these might be open-ended questions as part of a survey, or they might be a focus group, or you might go along to an interview, depending on what type of study you sign up to, and there are a variety available to you. Now I've said there are 2 qualitative studies. You can do more than that if you're interested in, and I'd actually recommend going along to as many as you like and feel comfortable, because they are quite a good learning experience. So from this, you're going to write a reflection on that experience and then submit that with your final report. So you'll be able to take part in these studies from Monday of week 2, so that's when they open, and they'll run all the way up until the day that the report is to be submitted, so you can go along and participate at any time throughout that period. The reflection is due with that final report. So remember, with your reflection, you're not just going to be describing what studies you did or what was involved. You're going to be actually reflecting on that experience, thinking about how it was for you as a participant. Do you think you provided good information? Do you think that the questions would be likely to give the researcher good insight? Should they perhaps have used a different method? How could they have done things differently to improve that? Be a little bit insightful and a little bit perhaps critical, so that you can provide that reflection. We're looking for you to take that experience and show that you've learned something from it, not just go along and do it as an activity. So that's those open up from Monday of week 2. For part 2, you take the researcher perspective. So rather than being a participant, now you're going to be a researcher. With this part, you're going to choose one of the topics that's available to you, and you're going to read a little bit about that topic and go out and conduct 2 interviews with 2 participants. These interviews typically last about 30 minutes each, so you tell your respondent that's how long they can expect it to last, to make sure they're still willing to take part. And you're going to use the interview guide that's provided to go through a set of questions with the participant to try to get some insight into that research topic. You'll be able to prompt for more information, ask additional questions and things like that, so that you can get some good insights. You're going to record that interview and create a transcript of it, because you're going to then need to upload that transcript and analyze it. Right? So once you've done your 2 interviews and created the transcripts, you're going to upload it to the discussion board. So your transcripts will be uploaded to the discussion board. Everyone else's transcripts will be uploaded to the discussion board, so you can read through a bunch of those. You need to have that uploaded by Friday of week 4. You'll then be able to look through the full class data set or database, so that you can choose which interview transcripts you want to analyze. Now, when you conduct your interviews, your respondents are going to have to sign consent forms. So anytime they're participating in this type of research, people have to sign a consent form. And under Queensland legislation, the university needs to store that for 15 years. So that's why we need you to submit that consent form by Friday of week 5. For part 3, the communication of research, this is where you're going to conduct your analysis and write up a report. So this is where you'll go back and you'll look at all of those transcripts. You'll find 6 transcripts. That'll be 2 of yours and 4 others, and you're going to conduct what's called a thematic analysis. Now, a thematic analysis is a way of drawing themes or common themes out of the interviews transcripts that you've selected. Tutors will go through this in a lot of detail in tutorials and give you some practice in tutorials. So that's where tutorials become really quite valuable. They'll also talk through how to write up the report in tutorials as well. So this final section, you're going to be conducting that thematic analysis based on how you're guided in tutorials and then writing up a report. You're going to submit that final report on Friday of week 6. It's the 3 parts of the qualitative project. For the quantitative project, which is indicated with this different little graphic, there's also 3 sections, and they correspond to the same sections as the qual project. So part 1, you're going to take the participant perspective again. This time you'll have the opportunity to take part in 2 quantitative studies, so things like surveys, lab experiments, and so on. Again, they'll often take between say 15 and 30 minutes. Quant studies tend to be a little bit shorter. You're going to write up a reflection on that and then submit that with your final quantitative project. Those studies will open from Monday of week 7. So when you're reflecting on something like this, because you've already done qualitative studies, your reflection might include a bit of a comparison to the qualitative studies, or a comment or a bit of a discussion around whether or not you think quantitative was more appropriate or qualitative was more appropriate, so that you can sort of bring in your knowledge at this point. Part 2 of the quantitative project, you're going to go out and collect some survey data from 2 people. So a survey will be provided to you. You'll go out and find 2 respondents who meet our survey respondent criteria and administer a survey to them. And that survey typically takes about 15 minutes, so it's not too long. You're then going to enter that survey data via a link into our class database by Friday of week 8. So that the full data set can be analysed. You will again need to provide consent forms, and they'll need to be submitted by Friday of week 9. Part 3 of the quantitative project is again the communication of research, where you're writing up the report. So what's going to happen here is that the teaching team will analyse that data, that full data set of hundreds and hundreds of responses, because with quantitative surveys and experiments we need a lot more data than just a few interview transcripts. So all of that's going to be analysed statistically, and then those results will be fed back to you as part of module 4 or during module 4, and then you'll need to write up a report. So the analysis will actually be done for you. All you need to do is write up that report, drawing on that analysis and demonstrating that you understand what that analysis is showing. You'll submit that report on Friday of the final week of semester. So that's a nice sequence of due dates across those pieces of assessment. What you might do is look at the assessment documents.
So if you go to the modules page on Canvas and scroll down to the assessment section of that page, what you'll find is an overviews section. And if you click on that, what you'll be able to see is general details of the 2 pieces of assessment, such as their weighting, that they're individual assignments, the overall grading approach that we're using with that assessment, and the assurance of learning goals for that assessment. So the assurance of learning goals are essentially the aspects of your degree that the university is hoping for you to attain through working on these pieces of assessment. Underneath that are details of the qualitative project and the quantitative project. So if you click on that, you'll see a range of information that will basically outline everything that you need to do in all of the documents that you'll be working with. So here you see details of the qualitative project, part 1, part 2 and part 3 that I talked about previously. The key dates when things are due. You've got some information on the weighting, the length of the report, and then a general caution around submitting late and submitting incorrectly. So in terms of late submission, the standard QUT late submission policy does apply, meaning that you have 48 hours after the official deadline to submit your work, but if you don't submit following that, then you receive a grade of 0. And also that we don't permit work to be completed using generative AI tools such as ChatGPT with these projects. Scrolling down further, you've got key documents that you're going to make use of with this project. So that one of the most important ones is this first one, which is the qualitative project guide. So let's download that and have a quick look at it. So if you look here, basically this guide contains a lot of the information that is on that main page that I've just been through, such as key dates and weightings and some details of each of those portions. But over the page, or the second page of that, there are step-by-step instructions on what you need to do to complete the portions of that assignment, or the parts of the assignment. So for the participant perspective, which is part 1, you're going to log into SONA and you're going to look at the studies that are available. You're going to be able to register for 2, take part in those and reflect on the experience. You're also going to, for part 2, the researcher perspective, conduct 2 interviews, transcribe the interviews, upload your transcripts to the Canvas discussion board, and then also submit your consent forms. And then for part 3, you're going to select some transcripts to analyze. You're going to code and analyze those, write up your report, add an appendix, and submit that as part of your assessment. So all of the details, step by step, are laid out on this document. So make sure you download this, store it somewhere, and refer to it in completing the project. This final part of the this document is quite important because it outlines the penalties that will apply if you don't complete certain parts, such as uploading your data or submitting your consent forms. And essentially what that is that you get a 20% penalty if you don't complete any one of those things. Right? So it's a maximum of 20%. If you don't do any of it, you still get 20%. But if you don't submit consent forms or you don't upload your data, then you get a 20% penalty. It is quite a heavy penalty because consent is an important thing in research. So you need to do that. So that's there to encourage you to complete that properly. All right, in terms of other documents, you've got a participation and reflection guide. So this will assist you with completing part 1. So if I download that, you can see here that this document basically provides a rationale for the participation and reflection aspect of the project, gives you some guidance on choosing a study, talks about how to participate and the value you might get out of it, and then also guides you through what to consider in reflecting on the studies that you took part in. So you get a lot of guidance around each of these sections, and as you can see here with part 1, a lot of information is provided on how to go about completing that. If we go back to the page for part 2, which is where you're going to be completing your interviews, you've got 4 topics to choose from this semester. So digital gaming, digital influencers or social media influencers, television viewing habits, and then online purchasing. You'll be able to open these documents and have a read of the details of that. So for example, with digital gaming, if we open that, what you see here is some information on the background of digital gaming, a few stats on that, the general research question that you're going to answer, information on collecting the data, a few references to get you started in thinking about that, and then down here an interview guide which specifies the questions that you will ask as part of your interview once you've chosen your interview participant. So again, you get a lot of guidance through each of these in completing each of these sections. You've also got your consent form here, and it's different for each topic, so make sure you download that and have your participants complete that. So if you look here with the digital gaming consent form, what you're going to do is enter your name and email address and phone number here. Your participant is going to read all of this and then over the page provide their signature here to consent into the study, and it's this consent form that you're going to upload for each of your respondents as part of your assignment. Okay, down further you've got a report write-up guide. So if we download and access that, you'll see here that for part 3, again you get a lot of guidance in terms of how to write up your report. So an overall structure of the report, and then down here further what to include in each of those portions of the report. Okay. And then finally you've got a click here to submit work for this assignment option. If you select that, you'll go to the page here which provides you with links or directions for how to upload your data, how to upload your consent form, and how to submit your report. You can also access that through this assignments link at the side. So just finally, if we go to the quantitative project link here, you'll see that it's structured very similarly. We've got an overview of the project, the key dates, and information on the project, as well as key documents, and these will be made available later in the semester once we get to that. But you can read the quantitative project guide there if you'd like.
All right, a little bit of detail about how you get started on part one, which is taking part in your qualitative studies. You do that through a system that allows you to identify qualitative studies that are currently available within the business school for you to take part, and that's what we call the SONA system. You'll get your username and password emailed to you at the end of week one during semester, so that might be over the weekend of end of week one, and then you'll be able to log into the system and sign up to one of the studies. Now there's a variety of studies available. Most are going to be about 20 to 30 minutes. Some are online and some are in-person studies. Now it's important to note that, as with all research, and we'll talk about this during our ethics lecture, if you feel uncomfortable taking part in research, or you go along to a study and start to feel uncomfortable, you're always allowed to withdraw at any point in that study. So no one wants to force you to do something that you don't want to do, so you're able to withdraw at any point in time from those studies. Having said that, though, don't be overly concerned. None of the studies in the AMB 201 listing are controversial or detrimental or harmful in any way. They're very benign studies. You might get asked on your thoughts of a particular commercial or what you feel about a brand such as Adidas. It's a very general type of study. This final point here is an important one. So if you're unwilling altogether to take part in research for ethical reasons or religious reasons, that's entirely okay. You don't have to take part in this at all. It's an entirely it's simply an opportunity available to you. If you don't want to take part, make sure you let me know by the end of week 3, and we can arrange an alternative for you. That alternative is trying to get that same experience by reading published research, and then you can critically evaluate the way you think a participant may have experienced that research and the way that that might be improved in the future. So it's trying to get that same experience through written documents. Make sure you let me know by week 3 so that we can arrange that if that applies to you. I'll just go to the system here so you can see how you do actually sign up to some of these studies. You'll arrive at a page like this, which is what we call the SONA system. You'll get your username and password, and you arrive on a page that looks like this. This is your SONA homepage. You can click View Available Studies to see a list of studies within the business school that are currently open to AMB 201 students. Not all researchers have studies open to us, but a lot do, so that's quite handy for us. You can read through the titles and the little descriptions to work out which one is of interest to you. You can click on that particular study to have a read of the detail and view when time slots are available, and also where, so you can see the time here and also the location. In order to sign up to that study, you simply click sign up, confirm your sign up, and then you are essentially registered into that study. Importantly though, if you are not able to take part, make sure you go in and cancel out of that study using this view or cancel study information link here. That's really important, especially for in-person studies, because there is a researcher waiting for you to attend. So click cancel. Yes, I want to cancel, and then you're all cancelled out of that study. All right, as a way to round this out, remember that QUT's late assessment policy is still in force. This means if you submit your assessment beyond the deadline, that it's an automatic 0. So that's university policy, not something that we can control in AMB 201. Make sure if you are going to submit late that you apply for an extension. And finally, academic misconduct. Please be aware of plagiarism policies and cheating policies at QUT. Unfortunately, these are becoming more and more prevalent. It'd be nice to say that they were becoming less prevalent, but they're actually increasing. We're seeing more and more cases of these all the time. Plagiarism is a big one, but cheating is becoming more common as well. And I think part of this is the prevalence of the online assignment writing services that are becoming available and students using those. Often it's very obvious when students use those. I don't think you're doing yourself much of a favor if you do use those services. You don't ever really want to turn up to a job and not be able to do something, or not have some skill that you claim that you've had. you've got the link to QUT's academic misconduct policy down here, and you can see exactly what that entails and the penalties that are involved. Make sure you're aware of that. It's pretty serious. So just a bit of a note on what each of those entail. Plagiarism is copying someone else's work and not attributing it and making it appear as if it's your work. Academic cheating is allowing someone else to do your assignment, or perhaps sharing your assignment with another person. All right, now if you do have any questions about the unit or the assessment requirements, please make a note of that. You can raise those with me if you come along to the in-person session, or your tutors during the first tutorial, or any of the tutorials really. Your tutors will be going over the assessment requirements in a fair bit of detail in that first tutorial. So if you've missed something or are a little bit confused about something, make sure you note down your questions so that you can ask them then. All right, so what have we covered today? I know it's a fairly long introduction, but it's important to run through everything in a fair bit of detail and explain how the unit runs. So we've covered that in a fair bit of detail and gone over the assessment. The next video in this module will give you a good introduction to marketing and audience research, and we'll also talk a little bit about possible careers in research that you can go down.